Tanzi, Meagan Byrnes, Apatawaco-Sisan, Hamilton, Ontario, Nichun. Hi, my name is Meagan Byrne. I am Apatawaco-Sisan, which is the Cree word for Métis, and I come from Hamilton, Ontario. And today, I don't have a really cool project to show you, even though everything here has been so awesome so far, but what I do have to talk about is a document that imagineNATIVE and the Indigenous Screen Office, together with a large cohort of advisors and cultural experts, got together to deal with a pressing problem that has been going on since, I guess, the beginning of stories being taken from Indigenous people. Sorry. So this was supported in part by Ontario Creates, the CMF, Creative BC, the NFB, Telefilm, and the InSpirit Foundation. So this came out of a conversation that happened in 2017 at a Hot Docs Summit. I wasn't there for the conversation, but essentially it was, why do we keep allowing our stories to be mined the same way that they have mined our land and taken the oil from the ground? And it was kind of a striking point where people realized that, yes, in fact, this is happening in Indigenous communities, that just like the land had been taken, just like the resources had been taken, now stories and people's histories were starting to be taken. So this was done over about 3 years. There were very many people involved. These aren't even all the people who were involved in the making of this. But it was inspired and directed by the Indigenous artists, filmmakers, and creatives that sort of had brought up the problem in the first place. You probably all know about Jesse Wente, and if you don't, he is an amazing speaker, writer, and also is the director of the Indigenous Screen Office. And he talks about Native sovereignty and narrative sovereignty, and that is something that is a term we've started to use now when it talks about it's not enough to just own our place. We need to own our own stories. We need to be the ones who make and tell and share our stories in the way that are good for us. And then I can just read what he says. When I talk about narrative sovereignty, what I'm really talking about is the ability of the nations to have some measure of control over the stories that are told about themselves. Throughout the entire history of filmmaking, the overwhelming majority of stories told about Indigenous peoples, both fictional and documentary, have been told by non-Indigenous people. And this is something that I also bring up at a lot of events. So I myself am a game maker at imagineNATIVE. I work as the coordinator for digital and interactive works, both in the festival and in our institute. And one thing that I say at my talks is that essentially every understanding we have about what is Indigenous, what looks Indigenous, what feels Indigenous, has been curated by non-Indigenous people. So the idea of Indigenous authenticity has not actually been created in an authentic way, one would say even, and that in fact it plays on a lot of tropes and a lot of stereotypes that continue even to this day. So because Indigenous is kind of a catch-all, just in the way European is a catch-all, one of the things when people are like, oh, we're working on an Indigenous project, and I'm like, okay, with who? Because to say Indigenous is the same as saying European. You wouldn't say I'm working on a European project, you would say I'm working on this project with the French, or I'm working on this project with the Italians. So it's the same thing for us. And we also had to recognize and respect that in this document, that this document couldn't be a catch-all. So in fact, it is not a what to do, it's a how to do. So there's nothing in this document that tells you what you should be doing in terms of literally talking to a group. What it is, in fact, is more like a workbook. So I'm just going to go briefly over how to use this. So the great thing about this document, so there's a printed document which comes in English and French. So in the same document, it is fully bilingual and has been double, triple checked for French accuracy. We also have free PDFs on the imagineNATIVE and also, I believe, on the Indigenous Screen Office website. So the first section is on how you use the protocols, so in which situations they would be used, why would you want to have them, why would you be thinking about using them. Mostly this is in context with Are you thinking about a project going forward with an Indigenous group or an Indigenous story, or even about an Indigenous person that may be deceased? So it talks about why would you want to use this. The second section talks about how you implement the protocols. So it goes into, once you have your protocols, once you've made them, therefore, how will you now implement them? And one of the big things that I always bring up over this is you can't do this after you've already put together your prototype. I have had, as somebody who's kind of a bit of a lightning rod for Indigenous digital projects, I have had people come to me and be like, oh, we have this really cool project, we'd like to implement protocols. And I was like, okay, where are you at? And almost always they're already at the prototype phase, and in some cases they're already seeking funding. At that point, it's too late. So one of the things that we do bring up a lot is, are you okay with hearing no? And you should be okay with hearing no. And if you're not okay with hearing no, then you need to stop the project where you're at. And if you do hear no, can you strip out the offensive material to the community that you're talking with? And if you can strip it out, why is it there in the first place? So these are kind of things that come up in the protocols that you should be thinking from day one. It also is important to note that the protocols are not sort of a one and done. Everything that you do with an Indigenous community needs to be for life. And if that is too heavy of a responsibility for you, then it probably shouldn't be done. So one of the things in here, we also have the appendixes on understanding worldviews. So like I said, Indigenous kind of covers a huge umbrella of terms. So we also point out how you need to really know about the group that you're working with and that you're talking about. And again, it's why it has to be a lifelong relationship, and it has to start before the project's even at the prototyping phase. It goes into mostly Canadian, but this can be used across the globe. You're going to have to do a lot of research about who you're talking to. And then we also have community resources in here. And again, this is very Canadian based, but again, that's because it was funded and done by Indigenous artists in Canada. But overall, everything in here can be used for almost any screen-based project, but also any project that involves any Indigenous community. That could be arts-based. So if you're doing theater, there's no reason why you couldn't have protocols in place. Anytime you are taking from a community, and even if you don't consider that taking, you do have to understand that there are Indigenous ways of owning things, and that those things, even though a person or a family may own something, the community could have right to override, or a community could say it's okay, but the family has rights to that story or that thing, and they can override. So these are things that you have to understand going into these groups, and that's something that the protocols help develop as a base for any artistic organization or any company. So we do want to state that these are not a rigid guideline. It is sort of like a workbook, much in the same way you would learn how to do accounting. The guides is sort of like learn how to make your own protocols, learn how to use your own protocols. Also, it needs to fit with the group that you're working with and fit with you. Like, this is a conversation and it is a relationship. This isn't just a one-way street in either case. It's better not to think of it as like, I'm paying you money and I get a thing. It's more like, hey, we're entering into a friendship. So these will grow as time goes on. And then I kind of already went into the intent over the whole thing. And I can talk about that more in the panel. But if you'd like to order a copy, you can do so online. You can also do through imagineNATIVE. I also have about 10 copies available for sale. The hard copy is $60 each, but the PDF is available online for free. Thank you.